What if the global economy collapsed overnight? What if the US entered a recession and the domino effect crushed entire countries? It may sound extreme, but the truth is, many nations are standing on the edge, relying on the US for survival. Some depend on American trade, while others have built their economies on US investments and exports. When the US stumbles, these countries could completely collapse. You'd be shocked to find out which nations are teetering on the brink. The world has seen numerous significant events unfold recently, and the interconnectedness of our global financial system means that tremors in one major economy can trigger earthquakes elsewhere. Today, we will explore the potential ramifications of a hypothetical yet plausible scenario: a severe economic downturn in the United States. We'll examine 10 countries whose economies are intricately linked to the US and could face catastrophic consequences. We will delve into the specific vulnerabilities of each nation, analyzing trade volumes, investment dependencies, and other crucial economic ties. Stick around until the end, where we'll summarize our findings and offer some concluding thoughts on this precarious global situation. Before we dive in, if you find this analysis insightful, please consider subscribing to our channel and hitting the like button. Your support is incredibly important for helping us grow and continue producing content like this. Also, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing from our global audience. Now, let's begin our examination. You might think that Mexico, sharing a long border and deep historical ties with the US, would be somewhat insulated from the immediate impacts of an American recession. However, the reality is quite the opposite. You'd be shocked at how deeply connected these two economies really are. With billions upon billions of dollars in trade flowing between the US and Mexico every single year, a sudden economic downturn in America would devastate Mexico's economy. Consider this: in 2023, approximately 80% of Mexico's total exports were destined for the United States. This isn't just a small fraction, it's the vast majority of their international sales. The key products leading this charge include automobiles, sophisticated electronics, and a wide array of agricultural products. When American consumer demand drops, as it inevitably does during a recession, the orders for these Mexican goods would plummet. This reduction in demand would send shockwaves through Mexican industries, leading to factory slowdowns, reduced production, and significant job losses. You'd be surprised how quickly that could lead to rising unemployment and widespread poverty across Mexico. Imagine the impact on automotive plants in cities like Puebla or Guanajuato, or the electronic assembly lines in Tijuana, suddenly facing drastically reduced orders. The ripple effects would extend far beyond these primary industries, affecting suppliers, logistics companies, and local businesses that depend on the wages of factory workers. But the trade relationship is only part of the story. Mexico's growing dependence on remittances from the US has also become a crucial lifeline for many families. Millions of Mexican nationals working in the United States send a portion of their earnings back home, supporting households across the country. These remittances constitute a significant source of foreign exchange for Mexico and provide essential income for families, often used for basic necessities like food, housing, and education. If US wages decline, or more drastically, if unemployment rises significantly among the Mexican diaspora in the States during a recession, these vital remittances would slow to a trickle. The impact would be devastating, particularly in rural communities where remittance income is often a primary means of survival. Entire communities struggling to survive would be left in an even more precarious position. The reduction in this financial flow would not only impact individual households, but also dampen overall domestic consumption within Mexico, further exacerbating the economic downturn caused by reduced exports. You might think that Mexico's internal market could compensate, but the combined effect of lost export revenue and diminished remittances would likely overwhelm the domestic economy. The result? A country pushed to the very edge of collapse, facing not just economic hardship, but potentially significant social and political instability as well. The intricate web connecting the two economies means that a US recession wouldn't just be a minor setback for Mexico. It could be an existential threat. Please make sure to watch this video until the very end, as we will provide crucial conclusions based on our analysis. What if Canada's reliance on the U.S. economy was the reason its own survival is at risk? Sharing the world's longest undefended border and a deeply integrated economic relationship, Canada is profoundly linked to the fortunes of its southern neighbor. You'd be shocked at just how dependent Canada is on the United States. The U.S. is, by far, Canada's largest trading partner. Approximately 75% of all Canadian exports are destined for the U.S. market. This includes a vast range of goods, from automobiles and parts manufactured in Ontario to lumber from British Columbia and agricultural products from the prairies. If the U.S. falls into a recession, the demand for these Canadian goods would inevitably shrink. American consumers and businesses would cut back on spending, leading to canceled orders and reduced exports for Canadian companies. Canada's economy, heavily reliant on this trade flow, would be in big trouble. Major sectors like manufacturing, particularly the auto industry, which is heavily integrated across the border, would face significant downturns. Layoffs and factory closures could become widespread, impacting not just large corporations, but also the numerous small and medium-sized businesses that form the backbone of the Canadian supply chain. The economic pain would be felt across provinces and territories, highlighting the vulnerability that comes with such concentrated trade dependence. You might think Canada could survive on its natural resources alone. After all, the country is rich in oil, gas, minerals, and timber. However, the truth is that the prices for many of these commodities, especially oil, are closely tied to American demand and the overall health of the global economy, which the U.S. heavily influences. A slowdown in the U.S. economy would push global oil prices down. This would lead to a massive hit to Canada's oil sector, centered primarily in Alberta. Reduced oil revenues would strain provincial budgets, lead to significant job losses in the energy industry and related services, and potentially trigger defaults on loans tied to energy projects. Furthermore, the impact isn't limited to oil. Reduced construction and manufacturing activity in the U.S. would also dampen demand for Canadian lumber and minerals. This downturn in commodity sectors could also trigger a housing market crash, particularly in regions heavily reliant on resource industries. Canadian real estate markets, already facing affordability challenges in major cities like Toronto and Vancouver, could become even more volatile if a recession leads to widespread job losses and reduced purchasing power. You might think Canada's strong social systems could buffer the population, but the sheer scale of the economic strain caused by a deep U.S. recession could push the country toward a financial crisis. Government revenues would decline just as demand for social support programs like unemployment benefits increases, putting immense pressure on public finances. This could lead to difficult choices regarding austerity measures or increased borrowing, potentially leaving millions of Canadians scrambling for stability in the face of job losses, reduced incomes, and a contracting economy. Could Canada survive without its U.S. ties? Given the depth of integration, it's not likely without severe disruption and hardship. Have you ever wondered how vulnerable a tech giant like South Korea could be to a U.S. recession? As a global leader in electronics, semiconductors, and automotive manufacturing, South Korea's economy is a powerhouse, but its success is intricately linked to the American market. You'd be shocked by how interconnected their economies truly are. South Korea is the home of global powerhouses like Samsung and Hyundai. A vast portion of their exports, particularly high-value tech goods and automobiles, head straight to the U.S. In 2023, more than 14% of South Korea's gross domestic product came directly from exports to the United States. This highlights a significant dependence on American consumers and businesses. The demand for smartphones, televisions, memory chips, and cars manufactured by South Korean companies is heavily influenced by the economic health of the U.S. When the U.S. economy falters, American consumers tighten their belts, delaying purchases of big-ticket items like cars and electronics. Businesses also cut back on IT investments, reducing orders for semiconductors and other components. A sudden recession in the U.S. would dramatically reduce the demand for South Korea's products, sending ripples throughout its export-oriented economy. The semiconductor industry, which is South Korea's biggest single export sector and a critical component of the global tech supply chain, would face a severe downturn. American tech companies like Apple, Dell, and HP are major buyers of South Korean memory chips and processors. If these U.S. companies slash their budgets due to falling consumer demand or economic uncertainty, the orders for South Korean semiconductors would plummet. This would have a direct impact on giants like Samsung Electronics and SK Hynix, potentially leading to reduced production, lower profits, and significant layoffs within this high-skilled sector. You'd think that would only be the beginning, right? The fallout wouldn't just affect the tech sector. The automotive industry, led by Hyundai and Kia, also relies heavily on the U.S. market. A drop in American car sales would directly impact South Korean auto manufacturers and their extensive network of suppliers. The combined effect of downturns in both the tech and auto sectors would be substantial, affecting employment, investment, and overall economic growth. The financial strain could lead to a collapse of consumer confidence within South Korea itself, as fears of job losses and economic instability spread. This could trigger an economic domino effect, potentially leading to massive job losses and widespread economic instability, impacting not just large corporations, but also the smaller businesses that support these major industries. The reliance on the U.S. market makes South Korea particularly susceptible to an American downturn, potentially stalling its economic engine and causing significant hardship. Would South Korea survive a recession in the U.S.? Given its export structure, it's a ticking time bomb. What if Brazil, the largest economy in South America and a significant global player in agriculture and resources, could be taken down by something as simple as a U.S. recession? Despite its size and diverse resource base, Brazil's economic health is surprisingly intertwined with the United States. You'd be shocked to learn that Brazil's economy is far more dependent on the U.S. than you might think. Brazil's exports to the U.S. cover a wide range, including crucial commodities like soybeans, iron ore, crude oil, and manufactured goods like aircraft components. In 2023, over 20% of Brazil's total exports went to the United States, making it a vital market for Brazilian producers. This means any significant reduction in U.S. demand, which would inevitably occur during a recession, would have catastrophic effects on Brazil's economy. American industries would reduce orders for raw materials like iron ore, and consumers might cut back on products indirectly reliant on Brazilian inputs. Furthermore, the agricultural sector, a cornerstone of the Brazilian economy, would face a steep decline in profits. The U.S. is a major importer of Brazilian agricultural products, either directly or indirectly through global commodity markets influenced by U.S. demand. A U.S. recession would likely lead to lower global commodity prices for items like soybeans and coffee, hitting Brazilian farmers and agribusinesses hard. This would impact rural incomes, potentially exacerbating existing issues of poverty and inequality, especially in agricultural regions. The downturn in trade would lead to job losses not only in farming, but also in related sectors like transportation and processing. But wait, the shockwaves wouldn't stop there. Brazil's government debt has skyrocketed in recent years, reaching concerning levels relative to its GDP. This high level of debt leaves the country vulnerable to any external economic shock. A U.S. recession would likely lead to tighter global credit conditions and potentially higher borrowing costs for emerging markets like Brazil. If global commodity prices fall due to lower demand from the U.S. and other recession-hit economies, Brazil's export revenues would decline, making it harder for the government to service its debt and fund public services. This would put enormous pressure on the Brazilian real, the national currency. A depreciating currency could fuel inflation, eroding the purchasing power of ordinary Brazilians and potentially leading to widespread social unrest. Imagine a country already struggling with significant inequality and high unemployment facing a perfect storm of falling exports, lower commodity prices, rising inflation, and difficulty accessing international credit. Could Brazil pull through? Its resilience would be severely tested. The combination of trade dependency, commodity price volatility, and high government debt makes Brazil highly susceptible to the negative impacts of a U.S. recession. It's a highly uncertain situation where an external shock could trigger a deep internal crisis. What if India's massive outsourcing industry, a key engine of its modern economy, came crashing down because of a U.S. recession? India, with its booming population and rapidly growing service sector, has become deeply integrated into the global economy, particularly through its ties with the United States. You'd be shocked by how much India depends on the US for its economic stability. The truth is, India's booming tech and service industries rely heavily on American contracts. Companies across the US outsource a vast range of functions, from software development and IT support to customer service and business process operations, to Indian firms. In fact, official data shows that nearly 60% of India's entire IT sector revenue comes from clients based in the United States. This makes the Indian IT and business process outsourcing, BPO, sectors incredibly vulnerable to fluctuations in the US economy. So, what would happen if the US went into a recession? A sudden slowdown in the US economy would lead American companies to slash their IT budgets and cut back drastically on outsourcing to save costs. Major US corporations, facing declining revenues and economic uncertainty, would likely cancel or postpone projects, reduce the scope of existing contracts, and bring some operations back onshore. And guess what? That would directly hit India's job market, especially in major IT hubs like Bengaluru and Hyderabad, often referred to as India's Silicon Valley. Millions of highly skilled Indian professionals rely on the tech outsourcing industry for their livelihoods. A sharp drop in demand from the US would lead to widespread layoffs, hiring freezes, and salary cuts within these sectors. Companies like Tata Consultancy Services, Infosys, and Wipro, which employ hundreds of thousands of people, would face immense pressure. The result? A massive economic crisis for millions of Indians who depend on this sector. But that's not all. India's economy is also heavily dependent on remittances from Indian workers abroad, many of whom are employed in the United States, particularly in the tech and healthcare sectors. If the US economy crashes, many of these workers could face job losses or wage reductions. Consequently, the flow of money sent back into India would dry up significantly. These remittances are a vital source of income for countless families across India, often used for essential expenses, education, and investment in small businesses. A reduction in remittances would leave these families struggling and push more people into poverty, dampening domestic consumption and adding another layer of economic distress. Imagine the ripple effect across the country. Fewer jobs in the high-paying tech sector, reduced income for families reliant on remittances, higher inflation eroding savings, and growing sense of unrest. Could India handle it? Its large domestic market offers some buffer, but the reliance on US outsourcing and remittances makes it exceptionally vulnerable. Especially considering its existing challenges with poverty and unemployment, a US recession could severely derail India's growth trajectory, highlighting the fragile economic balance. Have you ever wondered how a US recession could devastate Turkey, a nation straddling Europe and Asia with a complex and often volatile economy? You'd be shocked to learn how interconnected Turkey is with the American economy, despite the geographical distance. Turkey's economy is already fragile, grappling with persistently high inflation that has eroded savings and purchasing power, alongside a weakening national currency, the lira. Official figures often show inflation rates soaring well into double digits, creating significant hardship for ordinary Turkish citizens. This pre-existing vulnerability makes Turkey one of the most susceptible countries to an external economic shock, such as a major US recession. So how could this happen? Well, Turkey's export market is heavily reliant on demand from developed economies, including the United States and Europe, whose economy is also closely linked to the US. Turkey exports a diverse range of goods, from textiles and apparel to automotive parts and machinery. A downturn in the US economy would inevitably reduce consumer demand for these Turkish goods. Furthermore, a US recession often triggers a broader global slowdown, impacting demand from European markets as well. This would send the country's export-driven industries into a tailspin, leading to factory closures, job losses, and reduced foreign currency earnings. But that's just the start. Turkey also depends significantly on foreign investment to finance its current account deficit and support economic activity. Much of this investment originates from or is influenced by US financial markets and investor sentiment. During a global recession triggered or exacerbated by a US downturn, investors typically become risk-averse and pull capital out of emerging markets perceived as less stable, like Turkey. American investors and funds would likely withdraw their money, seeking safer havens. This capital flight would put immense pressure on the Turkish lira, potentially causing a sudden and sharp devaluation. A weaker lira makes imports more expensive, further fueling inflation, and makes it harder for Turkish companies and the government to repay foreign currency-denominated debt. This could lead to a severe economic crisis, potentially involving defaults and requiring intervention from international bodies like the IMF. You might think that Turkey's strategic location between Europe and Asia would help it survive economic downturns. But the truth is that the country's reliance on American and European trade, capital flows, and even tourism, as recession hit Americans and Europeans cut back on travel, means that it could spiral into even deeper financial chaos. What happens when inflation skyrockets further? Unemployment rises, the currency collapses, and public discontent reaches boiling point. Turkey could face not only a severe economic crisis, but also heightened potential for political instability. Can Turkey survive without the U.S. market and investment? Given its current economic fragility, the answer isn't so clear, making a U.S. recession a particularly dangerous prospect for the nation. Have you ever wondered how a country with a history of dramatic economic struggles, like Argentina, could get even worse in a global downturn triggered by the U.S.? Argentina is a prime example of what can happen when an already vulnerable economy faces external shocks, particularly a recession in a major economic power like the United States. You'd be shocked at how much Argentina depends on external factors for its survival, despite its rich natural resources. Argentina's economy has been in turmoil for years, plagued by cycles of hyperinflation, currency devaluation, and sovereign debt crises. Inflation has recently soared over 100% annually, decimating savings and making basic goods unaffordable for many. The national currency, the peso, has been in near constant decline against the US dollar, further complicating economic management. Despite these internal challenges, the country still relies heavily on agricultural exports like soybeans, corn, oil, and wheat to earn foreign currency. While China is a major buyer, global commodity markets, heavily influenced by U.S. economic health, dictate the prices Argentina receives. The U.S. market itself is also a significant destination for some Argentine products. If the U.S. faces a recession, global demand for these commodities would likely plummet. Lower demand translates directly into lower prices for Argentinian exports. This reduction in export revenue would severely impact the country's ability to earn the U.S. dollars it desperately needs to pay for imports and service its massive foreign debt. Argentina already struggles to meet its obligations to international creditors like the IMF. A drop in export income could make its already fragile financial situation untenable, potentially leading to another sovereign debt crisis and default. Imagine the government defaulting on its obligations. The consequences would be dire. But the reliance on external factors doesn't end there. Argentina also depends on foreign investment and access to international loans. With U.S. banks and global financial institutions tightening their belts during a recession, it could become nearly impossible for Argentina to secure new loans or roll over existing debt. Capital would likely flee the country as investors seek safety, putting further downward pressure on the peso and fueling even higher inflation. What happens when a nation defaults on its debt? Inflation runs rampant, and essential imports become scarce. The result could be economic collapse, triggering widespread social unrest and political instability in a country already weary from decades of economic mismanagement. You might think that a country like Argentina, having faced crises before, would be able to handle it. But the truth is that its reliance on external trade, volatile commodity prices, and foreign debt makes it extremely vulnerable to a U.S.-led recession. The situation is a ticking time bomb, and a U.S. recession could set off the chain reaction that sends it into even deeper financial turmoil. Can you imagine a world where Saudi Arabia, the undisputed powerhouse of the Middle East and the world's leading oil exporter, crumbles because of a U.S. recession? It seems almost unthinkable, given the kingdom's immense oil wealth, yet its economy is deeply tied to the fortunes of the United States. You'd be shocked at just how profoundly Saudi Arabia's economy depends on the U.S. market, and the global oil price is heavily influenced by American demand. Saudi Arabia's oil exports make up over 90% of its total government revenue. It's the lifeblood of the nation, funding everything from massive infrastructure projects and public sector salaries to social welfare programs. The United States has long been one of the kingdom's biggest customers for crude oil, although U.S. domestic production has altered this relationship somewhat in recent years. More importantly, however, the price of oil on the global market is extremely sensitive to demand from major economies, especially the U.S. Now imagine this. What happens when the U.S. faces a significant economic downturn and oil demand takes a nosedive? If the U.S. cuts back sharply on oil imports due to a weakened economy and a broader global recession reduces demand worldwide, global oil prices would likely plummet. Saudi Arabia, whose national budget is predicated on relatively high oil prices, would see its revenues collapse. The kingdom would lose a significant chunk of its income almost overnight. And guess what? That's just the tip of the iceberg. With oil prices falling, Saudi Arabia's entire financial system could crash. The government relies on oil revenue to maintain its vast spending commitments. A sustained period of low oil prices would force drastic cuts to public spending, potentially halting ambitious diversification projects like NEOM, part of Vision 2030 aimed at reducing oil dependency. It could lead to delays in infrastructure development, reductions in subsidies, and possibly even layoffs in the public sector, where a large portion of Saudi citizens are employed. You might think that Saudi Arabia could rely on its massive foreign currency reserves to weather the storm, and while these reserves are substantial, a prolonged downturn could deplete them faster than anticipated. The truth is that oil isn't just their main export. It's the backbone of their entire economy and social contract. Without a steady flow of revenue from oil sales, Saudi Arabia could face a massive financial crisis. Imagine a kingdom that has spent billions on projects to diversify its economy, only to see it all come crashing down due to factors beyond its control. What happens when unemployment spikes among its young population? Social programs are cut, and the implicit promise of prosperity fueled by oil wealth begins to fade. Saudi Arabia could find itself facing not just an economic crisis, but also unprecedented social and potentially political unrest. The reliance on a single commodity, however valuable, creates inherent vulnerability. Could the kingdom that dictates global oil supply find itself crippled by a drop in demand? A severe U.S. recession poses a serious, if often underestimated, threat to the stability of Saudi Arabia. Have you ever wondered how a country with such vast resources and Africa's largest population, like Nigeria, could crumble under the weight of a global recession triggered by the U.S.? Nigeria is one of those nations whose potential seems immense, yet it remains highly vulnerable to external economic forces, particularly shifts in the oil market dictated by powers like the United States. The prospect of a U.S. recession could be the tipping point for this complex and often unstable economy. You'd be shocked by how much Nigeria relies on global trade, and, overwhelmingly, its oil exports to maintain its economy. Nigeria's economy is extremely vulnerable to the whims of the global oil market. Oil makes up more than 90% of Nigeria's export revenue and a substantial portion of government income. Much like Saudi Arabia, Nigeria's national budget and economic stability are heavily dependent on the price and volume of oil exports. A large portion of its oil historically finds its way to the U.S. market, either directly or indirectly through global trade flows influenced by American consumption patterns. So, when the U.S. faces a recession and demand for oil drops globally, Nigeria's economy takes an immediate and severe hit. Lower oil prices mean drastically reduced government revenue and foreign exchange earnings. Without the cash flow from oil exports, the Nigerian government could struggle immensely to fund essential public services like healthcare, education, and infrastructure maintenance. This could trigger an economic crisis that sends the country into chaos. But the issues don't stop there. Nigeria also faces extreme poverty, high unemployment, especially among its vast youth population, rampant corruption, and significant political instability, including security challenges in various regions. A recession in the U.S. would exacerbate these problems. Furthermore, many Nigerian workers rely on remittances sent from abroad, including from the U.S. If the U.S. economy weakens, These financial lifelines could dry up, plunging families further into poverty. Imagine the ripple effect across the country: fewer government resources for development, rising unemployment leading to social unrest, diminished remittances hurting families, and potentially increased political instability. You might think Nigeria's sheer size and resource wealth, beyond oil, could protect it, but in reality, its over-reliance on oil ties the nation's fate directly to the volatile global oil market and, by extension, to the health of the U.S. economy. Could this be the breaking point for Africa's most populous nation? A U.S. recession could plunge Nigeria into a full-blown economic disaster, overwhelming its fragile infrastructure and governance systems. The answer might surprise you, as the nation's resilience is constantly tested. Have you ever stopped to think about how the world's second-largest economy, China, might be affected by a U.S. recession? China, which has enjoyed decades of unprecedented rapid economic growth fueled by exports and investment, could find itself in serious trouble if its largest trading partner stumbles. The reality is shocking. China is heavily dependent on the U.S. for its manufacturing and exports. In fact, despite recent trade tensions, China exports nearly $450 billion worth of goods to the United States every single year. This massive trade flow has been a critical driver of China's economic miracle. But what happens if that trade lifeline is cut off or severely restricted? In the event of a U.S. recession, consumer demand for Chinese goods, everything from electronics and clothing to furniture and toys, would take a nosedive. American consumers and businesses, facing economic hardship, would drastically cut back on purchases. China's manufacturing sector, which drives its economy and employs hundreds of millions of people, would suffer a severe slowdown. This could trigger widespread consequences: rising unemployment, particularly in coastal manufacturing hubs, factory closures, and an overall slowdown in economic growth. But that's just the beginning. China is already facing a massive internal debt crisis, with corporate and local government debt levels skyrocketing after years of stimulus-fueled growth. The Chinese government and businesses have borrowed extensively, often for infrastructure projects and real estate development that may not generate sufficient returns. A recession, coupled with reduced export demand, would make it even harder to service this massive debt pile. Furthermore, China is also reliant on American investment. If U.S. companies pull out or reduce their investments due to global economic uncertainty stemming from a recession, the financial impact could be catastrophic for China's economy. Imagine the scenario: a country that has thrived on rapid expansion suddenly hit with a multi-pronged economic crisis, falling exports, reduced investment, and a mountain of debt it struggles to manage, all while dealing with a shrinking or stagnant economy. How long could China keep its economy afloat under such pressure? To make matters worse, a recession in the U.S. would also mean reduced global demand for China's exports overall. Countries around the world would tighten their belts, reducing their consumption of Chinese-made products. The result? Even less business for China's manufacturers and further strain on an already fragile economic situation heavily reliant on global trade. This isn't just about the loss of the U.S. market. It's about a potential collapse in global demand hitting China's export engine hard. The intricate web of global trade means a U.S. recession could send shockwaves deep into the heart of the Chinese economy, challenging its growth model and potentially leading to significant social and political ramifications. Wow. It's clear that the economic instability caused by a potential U.S. recession could bring devastating consequences for some of the world's largest and most influential economies. The interconnectedness of the modern global financial system means that no country is truly an island. From oil-dependent nations like Saudi Arabia and Nigeria, whose entire budgets hinge on global energy prices heavily influenced by U.S. demand, to global manufacturing hubs like China, which rely immensely on American consumers, the ripple effects are undeniable and potentially catastrophic. We've seen how trade dependencies, reliance on foreign investment and remittances, commodity price volatility, and existing internal fragilities like high debt or inflation can create a perfect storm when a major economy like the U.S. falters. The question remains, Will these countries be able to withstand the shock, adapt, and find new paths to stability? Or will they collapse under the immense pressure, potentially triggering even wider global chaos? The future, in this interconnected world, is indeed highly uncertain. If you found this video insightful, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share it with others. We're committed to bringing you more eye-opening content like this, and your support helps us continue to provide insights into global economics. Thank you for watching.